HOA officers invaded my property thinking I was just an ordinary man in a Hawaiian shirt. How wrong they were. And I used brute force to teach them a lesson and detain them. If you've ever wanted to see power-tripping HOA officers learn that Hawaiian shirts don't mean harmless retiree, smash that like button. And drop a comment if you've ever been underestimated because of your wardrobe choices. Trust me, you'll love where this goes. Let me set the scene for you. I'm Marcus Tank Thompson, 42, and I spent 15 years as a Marine Corps drill instructor before retiring to what I thought would be peaceful suburban life in Oakwood Heights. The irony wasn't lost on me. A guy who once made grown men cry during boot camp, now living in a neighborhood where the biggest controversy was usually someone's grass being a quarter-inch too tall. I bought my house specifically because it sat right on the edge of the HOA boundary. Half my property was technically within Oakwood Heights Community Association jurisdiction, half wasn't. The previous owner had been some kind of surveying genius who'd managed this legal loophole, and I'd inherited his masterpiece of property line manipulation. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ex-Marine, buzz cut, probably looks like he could bench press a small car. Well, here's where life gets interesting. After I retired, I decided to fully embrace civilian life. I grew out my hair, traded my dress blues for cargo shorts and Hawaiian shirts, and spent my days working on vintage motorcycles in my garage. To the casual observer, I looked like just another middle-aged guy living out his Jimmy Buffett fantasy. The Oakwood Heights HOA board, led by their fearless president Richard Blackwell, had been eyeing my property for months. See, my house was the only one visible from the main road that didn't look like it had been assembled from a suburban starter kit. I had actual personality, a restored 1969 Camaro in the driveway, a workshop that looked lived in, and landscaping that prioritized function over HOA-approved aesthetic monotony. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early June. I was in my garage, wearing my favorite Hawaiian shirt, the one with pineapples and flamingos that my daughter bought me for Father's Day, working on rebuilding a Harley engine. The garage door was open, classic rock was playing, and I was in my element. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of clipboards being aggressively organized. I looked up to see 3 people standing at the edge of my driveway. Richard Blackwell himself, flanked by 2 other board members I'd seen around but never bothered to meet. Richard was a thin, nervous-looking man who dressed like he was perpetually attending a funeral for fun. His companions looked like they'd been recruited from a future Middle Managers of America convention. "Excuse me," Richard called out, not moving from his position at the property line. "Are you the homeowner?" I set down my wrench and walked over, wiping grease off my hands with an old rag. "That would be me, Marcus Thompson." Richard's eyes did a quick scan of my appearance. The Hawaiian shirt, the grease-stained hands, the relaxed posture of a man who wasn't intimidated by clipboard-wielding suburbanites. "I'm Richard Blackwell, president of the Oakwood Heights Community Association Board. We need to discuss some compliance issues with your property." "Compliance issues?" I kept my voice friendly, curious. No point in showing my cards too early. "Your landscaping doesn't meet community standards," said one of his companions, a woman whose haircut looked like it had been achieved with a ruler and a level. "The board has received complaints about the appearance of your property from the street." I glanced around my front yard. It was neat, green, and functional. Not magazine perfect like the rest of the neighborhood, but certainly not an eyesore. "And your vehicles," Richard added, gesturing toward my Camaro. "The HOA covenants specifically prohibit non-standard vehicle storage in driveways." "Non-standard," I repeated, still maintaining my friendly, slightly confused suburban dad tone. "It's a car. In a driveway. Seems pretty standard to me." The third board member, a guy who looked like he'd never touched anything more mechanical than a garage door opener, stepped forward. "Project vehicles must be stored in enclosed garages or off-site facilities." Now, this was interesting. They were quoting HOA rules at me, but they clearly hadn't done their homework on exactly which part of my property fell under their jurisdiction. "Well," I said, scratching my head in an aw shucks manner that would have made my old drill sergeant laugh, "I appreciate you stopping by to let me know about the concerns. I'll definitely look into it." Richard's expression shifted slightly. He'd been expecting either immediate compliance or an argument. My mild, reasonable response had thrown off his script. "We'll need to see written documentation of your compliance plan within 72 hours, he said, trying to regain his authoritative footing. "Sure thing," I nodded agreeably. "I'll get right on that research." As they walked away, I caught Richard saying something to his companions about easy cases and non-confrontational residents. The man had no idea he'd just poked a sleeping bear who happened to be wearing tropical fruit patterns. That evening, I pulled out the property surveys and HOA documents I'd inherited with the house. Time to do a little homework of my own. The next morning found me in my most intimidating outfit, another Hawaiian shirt, this one featuring surfboards and palm trees, and cargo shorts, sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by legal documents that painted a very interesting picture of my property situation. Here's what Richard Blackwell and his merry band of clipboard warriors had missed in their rush to hassle the laid-back guy in tropical wear. The property survey clearly showed that my driveway, my front yard, and most importantly, my garage were all on the side of the property line that fell outside HOA jurisdiction. The only part of my property actually subject to their rules was a narrow strip along the back fence, about 10 feet of lawn where I kept my garbage cans. Everything they complained about was legally beyond their reach. I was still chuckling about this discovery when my phone rang. My neighbor, Bill Martinez, sounded uncharacteristically agitated. "Marcus, you might want to know that HOA president was out here yesterday afternoon asking questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "Whether you were maintaining the property properly, if your cars were running, if you had any business operations going on." I told him you seemed like a decent guy who minded his own business, but he kept pressing. "Interesting." Richard was doing reconnaissance. "He also asked about your background," Bill continued. "Wanted to know what you did for work, how long you'd lived here, whether you seemed financially stable." Now that was crossing a line. One thing you learn in the Marines is that intelligence gathering usually precedes direct action. Richard was building a case for something bigger. 2 days later, I got my answer. A certified letter arrived from Blackwell and Associates Legal Services. Apparently, Richard moonlighted as a legal consultant when he wasn't busy terrorizing suburban driveways. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation written by someone who'd clearly watched too many court TV shows. It demanded immediate compliance with a laundry list of HOA violations, threatened daily fines of $50, and included a veiled suggestion that my automotive repair business was operating without proper permits. Automotive repair business? I was rebuilding a motorcycle in my own garage for personal use, but apparently Richard had decided I was running some kind of underground chop shop. The letter concluded with a demand for immediate access to my property for a comprehensive compliance inspection to be conducted by the HOA board within 48 hours. I read the letter twice, then called my old buddy Jake Martinez, no relation to Bill, who'd transitioned from the Corps to a successful career as a property rights attorney. "Jake, you're going to love this," I said, and read him Richard's legal masterpiece. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Marcus," Jake finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "please tell me you still have those property surveys." "Right here on my kitchen table." "And you're absolutely certain about the property lines?" "Jake, the HOA has jurisdiction over maybe 10 feet of my back lawn. Everything they're complaining about is outside their authority." "Then what this Blackwell character just sent you is legally equivalent to your neighbor demanding access to search your house because they don't like your curtains." That's what I thought, but I wanted to make sure. "Marcus, this isn't just harassment. Demanding access to private property under false legal authority is criminal trespass at minimum. If they actually show up trying to conduct this inspection, you have every right to treat them as trespassers." After hanging up with Jake, I sat on my back deck, drinking a beer and watching the sunset reflect off my Camaro's chrome. Richard Blackwell had made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed that a middle-aged guy in Hawaiian shirts would be an easy target for legal bullying. What he didn't know was that Marcus "Tank" Thompson had spent 15 years dealing with people who thought they could intimidate their way through life. I'd made a career out of teaching overconfident individuals about the difference between authority and authoritarianism. And unlike those Marine recruits, Richard hadn't signed up for the education I was about to provide. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I went to my bedroom closet and pulled out my old Marine Corps gear bag. Not because I needed the uniform, but because it contained some very useful equipment for dealing with trespassers. Richard Blackwell wanted to play games about property rights and legal authority. Time to show him what happens when you try to intimidate someone who actually understands both. Thursday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. I was in my garage working on the Harley, wearing my most cheerfully obnoxious Hawaiian shirt, the one with dancing hula girls and aloha written in glittery letters, when I heard multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the garage window, I watched Richard Blackwell emerge from his sedan, followed by his usual sidekicks plus 2 additions, a guy with a clipboard the size of a small table and another man carrying what appeared to be a professional camera. They'd brought documentation and evidence-gathering equipment. Richard had dressed for the occasion in what I can only describe as intimidation business casual. Dark slacks, white shirt, and a tie that probably cost more than my electric bill. He strode up my driveway like a general inspecting troops, clearly expecting his show of force to cow the simple-minded Hawaiian shirt guy into submission. "Mr. Thompson," Richard announced without preamble, "we're here to conduct the property compliance inspection as outlined in our legal notice." I set down my wrench and walked out of the garage, maintaining my relaxed suburban dad persona. "Morning, folks. Beautiful day, isn't it?" The photographer was already snapping pictures of my Camaro, while clipboard guy was furiously scribbling notes about unauthorized vehicle display and non-conforming automotive equipment. "Mr. Thompson," Richard continued, consulting his own oversized clipboard, "will need access to your entire property, including interior garage space, to document compliance violations." Interior garage space? I scratched my head, plain confused. "That seems like a pretty big request, Richard." "It's Mr. Blackwell," he corrected sharply. "And it's not a request. The HOA covenants clearly grant the board inspection rights to ensure community standards compliance." The photographer had moved on to taking pictures of my front yard, while the note-taker was documenting what appeared to be every blade of grass that dared to grow taller than regulation height. "Well," I said, maintaining my friendly tone, "I'd love to help you guys out, but I'm going to need to see some documentation first." Richard's expression shifted from confident authority to irritated impatience. "Documentation? You know, proof that you actually have the legal authority to conduct this inspection. Property surveys, jurisdictional boundaries, that sort of thing." "We don't need to prove anything to you," snapped the woman board member. "The HOA covenants clearly establish our inspection rights." "Over HOA property, sure," I nodded agreeably. "But I'm just curious about exactly which parts of my property actually fall under HOA jurisdiction." The silence that followed was telling. Richard's confident expression flickered slightly, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, someone on his team should have double-checked the property boundaries before launching this inspection mission. "The entire property is subject to HOA oversight," Richard declared, but his voice carried just a hint of uncertainty. "Really?" I pulled my phone from my pocket. "Because I've got the official property survey right here on my phone. Want to take a look?" The photographer had stopped taking pictures. The note-taker's pen hovered uncertainly over his clipboard. Richard's team was starting to sense that their fearless leader might not have done his homework. "We don't need to review your documents," Richard said quickly. "Our legal authority is clear." "Oh, I'm sure it is," I agreed. "Over the parts of my property that actually fall under HOA jurisdiction. But see, here's the interesting thing about property lines." I pulled up the survey on my phone and held it out. "This driveway where you parked? Not HOA jurisdiction. My garage? Nope. My front yard? Also no. That Camaro you've been photographing? Sitting on private property outside your authority." Richard's face was cycling through interesting color changes, but he wasn't backing down. "I don't care what your documents say. The HOA board has voted to conduct this inspection, and we're going to conduct it." And there it was. The moment when Richard Blackwell crossed from harassment into criminal trespass. "Richard," I said, my voice still friendly but with just a subtle shift in tone. "Let me make sure I understand. You're saying you intend to enter and search my private property regardless of whether you have legal authority to do so. We're conducting a lawful HOA inspection on property that's not under HOA jurisdiction. I don't accept your interpretation of the property boundaries." I nodded slowly. "Okay then. Just so we're all clear, you're refusing to leave my private property when asked, and you're demanding access to search my home and garage without legal authority. We have every right to be here." The photographer was looking increasingly uncomfortable. The note-taker had stopped writing entirely. Even Richard's loyal board members were starting to exchange uncertain glances. But Richard himself was doubling down, clearly believing that his suburban authority figure routine would eventually wear down the resistance of one middle-aged guy in a pineapple shirt. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "I understand you're confused about HOA procedures, but—" "Actually," I interrupted gently, "I understand perfectly. You're trespassing on my property, demanding access to search my home without authority, and refusing to leave when asked. That makes this a criminal matter rather than an HOA dispute." Richard's expression hardened. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all," I said, still smiling. "I'm just explaining the legal reality of your situation. See, the thing about property rights is that they're not really optional." I stepped back toward my garage, still maintaining eye contact with Richard. "Now, you folks have about 30 seconds to remove yourselves from my property before I start treating you like the trespassers you've just announced yourselves to be." Richard drew himself up to his full height, which was considerably less impressive than he seemed to think. "You can't intimidate us with empty threats." "Threats?" I grinned, and for the first time, let just a hint of my old drill instructor persona show through. "Richard, I haven't even started making threats yet." What happened next was like watching someone poke a sleeping grizzly bear with a pool noodle and then act surprised when the bear woke up. Richard, apparently mistaking my reasonable demeanor for weakness, made the tactical error that would define the rest of his day. Instead of cutting his losses and leaving, he decided to double down on stupid. "I'm calling the police," he announced, pulling out his phone. "You're interfering with lawful HOA business." "Richard," I said, my voice still calm, but with an edge that made the photographer take a step backward, "I strongly recommend you reconsider that course of action." But Richard was committed to his performance now. He dialed 911 while maintaining aggressive eye contact, clearly expecting me to cave under the pressure of impending law enforcement involvement. "Yes, I need officers at 1247 Maple Street," he said into his phone. "A resident is interfering with lawful property inspection and making threats." I pulled out my own phone and speed-dialed Jake Martinez. "Jake, it's Marcus. Remember that trespassing situation we discussed? Well, it just went active." While Richard was explaining to 911 dispatch how the dangerous Hawaiian shirt man was obstructing justice, I was calmly explaining to my attorney that I had 5 trespassers on my property who were refusing to leave and demanding access to search my home. "Marcus," Jake said, "are you recording this?" "Phone's been recording since they arrived." "Good. When the police get there, you have every right to demand these people be arrested for criminal trespass. They have zero legal authority to be on your property." Richard finished his call and turned back to me with a triumphant expression. "Officers are on their way. We'll see how tough you are when." That's when I decided the pineapple shirt performance had run its course. "Richard," I said, and this time I let my voice carry the full authority of 15 years teaching Marines the difference between confidence and stupidity, "you have made a series of very poor decisions today." The change in my demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The relaxed suburban dad disappeared, replaced by someone who had spent decades dealing with people who confused bluster with backbone. Richard's mouth kept moving, but no words came out. The photographer lowered his camera. The note-taker took an involuntary step backward. "See, here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice carrying across the yard with the kind of authority that makes grown men stand straighter without thinking about it. When those officers arrive, I'm going to show them the property survey proving you're trespassing. I'm going to play them the recording of you refusing to leave when asked. And I'm going to request that all 5 of you be arrested for criminal trespass. You can't. Richard stammered. Oh, but I can. And I will. I took a step forward, and Richard instinctively took 2 steps back. Because you made the mistake of assuming that a middle-aged guy in a Hawaiian shirt would be an easy target for your little power trip. The photographer was already walking back toward the cars. Smart man. But here's the really interesting part. I continued, my voice getting quieter, but somehow more commanding. I spent 15 years as a Marine Corps drill instructor. Do you know what that means, Richard? Richard was looking like a man who'd just realized he'd brought a water pistol to a gunfight. It means I have extensive experience dealing with people who think they can intimidate their way through life. It means I understand exactly what legal authority looks like and what bullying dressed up in clipboard authority looks like. The sound of approaching sirens was growing louder. And most importantly, I said, stepping close enough that Richard had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. It means I know exactly how to detain trespassers until law enforcement arrives. Richard's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade I'd call, oh shit, white. Now, I continued conversationally, you have about 90 seconds before those officers get here. You can either walk to your car and wait for them there like a civilized person, or you can find out what 15 years of Marine Corps combatives training looks like when applied to suburban trespassing situations. The remaining board members were already halfway to their cars. The note-taker was speed walking like his clipboard was on fire. But Richard, credit where credit's due, was still trying to salvage his authority figure routine. You're assaulting me, he declared, though his voice cracked slightly on assaulting. Richard, I said patiently, I haven't touched you. I haven't threatened violence. I've simply explained your legal situation and offered you a choice of how to handle it. The police cars pulled into my driveway just as Richard's remaining courage finally abandoned him entirely. 2 officers got out, and I could see them taking in the scene. 5 people clustered around cars at the end of my driveway, and 1 guy in a Hawaiian shirt standing calmly in his garage doorway. Afternoon, officers, I called out. I'm Marcus Thompson, the property owner. I believe someone here called you about a trespassing situation. And that's when Richard Blackwell learned the difference between having authority and pretending to have authority. Officer Jennifer Santos approached the scene with the practiced eye of someone who dealt with enough suburban disputes to recognize the difference between actual emergencies and neighborhood drama. Her partner, Officer Dave Chun, started taking statements from Richard's rapidly disbanding inspection team. Mr. Thompson, Officer Santos said, I understand there's been some kind of property dispute. Not exactly a dispute, I replied, maintaining my calm demeanor. More like a criminal trespass situation. Richard immediately launched into his prepared speech about lawful HOA inspections and uncooperative residents, but Officer Santos held up a hand to stop him mid-sentence. Sir, let me get the property owner's statement first, then I'll hear from you. I explained the situation clearly and factually. The property boundaries, Richard's demand for access to areas outside HOA jurisdiction, his refusal to leave when asked, and his explicit statement that he didn't care about legal authority. Do you have documentation of the property boundaries? Officer Santos asked. I pulled out my phone and showed her the official survey. She studied it carefully, then walked the property line with me, verifying the boundaries against the physical markers. Mr. Blackwell, she called out after completing her inspection. Could you show me exactly where the HOA's jurisdiction begins and ends on this property? Richard's confident demeanor evaporated as he realized he'd never actually researched the boundaries himself. He pointed vaguely toward my house and mumbled something about the entire residential area. Officer Santos consulted the survey again. According to this official document, the HOA's jurisdiction covers approximately 10 feet of rear lawn area. Is that your understanding? We the HOA covenants. Richard's legal bluster had completely abandoned him. Sir, Officer Santos said patiently, it's a simple question. Based on your knowledge of the property boundaries, do you have jurisdiction over the areas you were demanding to inspect? The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for everyone except me. I was enjoying watching Richard realize that confidence without competence eventually meets reality. I'm not certain about the exact boundaries, Richard finally admitted. But you demanded access to search Mr. Thompson's garage and property anyway? The HOA board voted to conduct the inspection. On property that you now admit you're not certain falls under your jurisdiction? Officer Chun had finished taking statements from the other board members, and his expression suggested they'd given him some very interesting information about Richard's leadership style and decision-making process. Mr. Thompson, Officer Santos said, "You mentioned you have a recording of today's interaction?" I played the relevant portions of the recording, including Richard's explicit statement that he didn't care about legal authority and intended to conduct the inspection regardless of jurisdiction. Officer Santos exchanged a look with her partner. "Mr. Blackwell, you were asked to leave private property by the owner, you refused, and you demanded access to search areas outside your legal authority. That constitutes criminal trespass. But I'm the HOA president." Richard protested. "Sir, being HOA president doesn't give you police powers. You can't demand to search someone's property without legal authority." Officer Chin stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwell, we're going to need you to come with us to discuss this situation further." What followed was the most satisfying 10 minutes I'd experienced since leaving the Marine Corps. Richard Blackwell, who'd arrived at my property that morning expecting to intimidate a middle-aged Hawaiian shirt enthusiast into submission, found himself being read his rights for criminal trespass. The remaining board members scattered like leaves in a hurricane, leaving Richard to explain to the officers why he'd thought demanding access to search someone's private property was a good idea. As the police car pulled away with Richard in the back seat, I noticed several of my neighbors had come out to watch the show. Bill Martinez walked over, grinning broadly. "Marcus, I've got to ask, what did you do before you moved here?" "Marine Corps drill instructor," I said, taking off the Hawaiian shirt to reveal the USMC tattoo on my forearm that I'd kept covered during my suburban dad performance. 15 years teaching overconfident people about the difference between authority and authoritarianism. And Richard never knew. Richard never asked. He made assumptions based on my wardrobe choices and decided I'd be an easy target for his power trip. 3 hours later, Jake Martinez called with an update. Richard had been charged with criminal trespass. The other board members had given statements distancing themselves from his decision-making, and the HOA's insurance company was very interested in discussing their liability for board members who exceeded their authority. 2 weeks later, I received a formal letter of apology from the new HOA president, elected after Richard's resignation, acknowledging that the previous administration had overstepped their authority and confirming that my property boundaries would be respected going forward. But the real victory came a month later when I was working in my garage, wearing my favorite pineapple Hawaiian shirt, and saw a moving truck in front of Richard's former house. The man who tried to intimidate me into submission had apparently decided Oakwood Heights wasn't the right neighborhood for him after all. The new HOA board, led by people who understand the difference between authority and overreach, has been refreshingly reasonable. They focus on actual community issues rather than terrorizing residents who don't conform to suburban conformity standards. Sometimes I almost miss Richard's entertainment value. Almost. But then I remember the pure satisfaction of watching someone who thought they could bully their way through life meet the consequences of their assumptions. The moral of the story? Never judge a book by its tropical fruit cover. Sometimes the middle-aged guy in the Hawaiian shirt has 15 years of experience dealing with people who mistake bluster for backbone. And sometimes, when you poke the bear pokes back. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.